Here are my thoughts on From Russia with Love, one of the most famous novels of the entire Bond series, one that is kind of its own book, its kind of distinct identity outside of Bond, and it is, spoiler alert, really, really good. For the first half of the novel, called, geniusly, it's called The Plan, there's no James Bond at all. In this segment, we get to know the Smersh characters. Their names, their motivations, all that jazz. And it's pretty interesting. Again, this is a very Cold War-centric novel, very Cold War-centric, in fact, because we're getting to know the atmosphere and the tone of the time. This was published, I believe, in 1957, so this is kind of perfect for the Cold War setting. We have no Bond for a large chunk of the story, so immediately it feels fresh and it feels interesting, because normally with a Bond novel, here's Bond, briefing with M, go, and there's the mission. With this one, however, we don't meet Bond for well over 100 pages, and that would sound like a criticism, but when we get to Bond, he's in an interesting place as a character. He's not particularly happy, he hasn't been given a big mission for ages, and I like there's a slight reference to Diamonds Are Forever, but for the most part it moves on fairly swiftly. With From Russia with Love, we already know Smersh's plan. Bond doesn't. And this allows us to be kind of one step ahead of Bond. We know the characters and we know their plan, but MI6 and Bond don't know that. So it makes the reading experience a bit more interesting than it would be otherwise if we were just like, here's Bond. Like, imagine how simplistic it would be if we met Bond and it was exactly the same, you just cut out the bit where you're introduced to all the Smersh characters. Wouldn't have the same impact. It would be far more sort of typical and uninteresting. It's so much more interesting to shake the formula up a little bit by introducing us to a bunch of new characters. That's cool. Pretty much all the Smersh characters are great. I really like Red Grant. He is fantastic in the film and he's fantastic in the original novel. The only weak link of the Smersh characters is probably Tatiana Romanov. She's a bit of a wuss, I'll be honest. She doesn't really prove herself as a character in this book, but that is the only gripe I have with this novel. Karen Bay's a great character. Bond is obviously great because he's James Bond, but he's probably at his most interesting since Casino Royale. This is probably the best novel in the series since Casino Royale. I'm struggling to choose between the two. Now, one thing I've griped about, or moaned about, to a degree, with this series is the standalone nature of all the novels. Now, some would say that's good, but I find it bizarre that such events are never referenced ever again. But this book ends on a definitive cliffhanger, right? It has got to get resolved, it has to be resolved in Doctor No, which I'm looking forward to. I hope it's a good resolution of this cliffhanger. But I think From Russia of Love is a very exciting novel. The chapters just kind of flow into each other very nicely. In terms of which From Russia of Love I prefer, the book or the film, I actually prefer the book. And the reason why is because the book spends a lot more time spending time with the Smersh characters. The film doesn't do that. We basically have a large chunk cut out. Now, I understand this. It was the second film in the series, so they wanted to just be like, James Bond. I think it would have been a very risky move for them to do a perfect adaptation, where, suppose they did do that, but the first half of Rush Love had no James Bond in it. Audiences wouldn't have responded to that. If you look at the posters of those early Connery films, they proclaim, Sean Connery is James Bond. They make a big deal of it. So I don't think that would have translated onto the big screen effectively, at least not as the second film. I think if they'd waited a bit longer, possibly. Anyway, the basic answer is that From Russia of Love is probably the best novel so far. Not sure. It's a toss-up between Casino Royale and From Russia of Love. It's very, very close. But I think if you just ignore the whole wider Bond media franchise and just look at this one novel, it's still very good. We're not relying on other adventures and other plots. We can just read this book and enjoy it for what it is, and that's a very, very finely tuned, if you will, story. But it ends on a cliffhanger. I don't know how it's going to get resolved, but the next novel is Doctor No. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on From Russia of Love, and I hope you enjoyed it.